The LDS Church was recently fined by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission for illegally hiding $32 billion in 13 shell companies. This has generated a lot of discussion on the topic of tithing, transparency, and accountability. The dizzying sum also has many wondering why a church with so much wealth continues to ask tithes of its destitute members. These are the very conversations the church was trying to avoid through their illegal deception. So let's discuss 7 problems with LDS tithing. In 2002, Gordon B. Hinckley was asked why the church doesn't disclose its finances to the public.
In my country, the Protestants, the Catholics, they publish all their budgets to all the public.
Yeah.
Why it's impossible for your church?
Well, we simply think that information belongs to those who made the contribution and not to the world. That's the only thing. Yes.
What Hinckley claimed here was a lie. The average tithe-paying member has no more access to the church's financial records than anyone else. They know only what it says at the bottom of the tithing slip, namely that all donations go towards the overall mission of the church. The church has not made its financial statements available to anyone, let alone tithe-paying members, since 1959. One might wonder what inspired the church's decision to conceal its wealth and expenditures. Roger Clark, the head of the church's investment arm, recently gave an unusually candid answer.
Paying tithing is more of a sense of commitment than it is the church needing the money. So they never wanted to be in a position where people felt like, they shouldn't make a contribution.
If what Roger says is true, then the church has intentionally hidden its finances for over 60 years to prevent members from making an informed choice not to tithe to an already wealthy church. Any member who paid tithing under this pretense, who otherwise would not have paid if they knew the extent of the church's wealth, has been defrauded. Let's look at Roger's claim that tithing is more about a sense of commitment than the church needing money. Has the church really been accepting donations from poor members for years, with no actual need for their sacrifice? Here's Elder Bednar to answer that question.
Given the significant financial strain that tithing is for those in war or in abject poverty, is there any discussion within the church about not requiring that for people in those situations, or at least tithing only what is left after paying for housing, food, and other necessities?
President Hinckley stood at this pulpit in 2000, made reference to the law of tithing. I remember watching him teach in impoverished areas of the country and promising the people the pathway out of poverty is keeping the commandments of God, including tithing. The church doesn't need their money, but those people need the blessings that come from obeying God's commandments.
From the mouth of 2 witnesses, we know that the LDS Church doesn't need any more tithing. So why does it continue to solicit tithes, especially from those for whom it is a major burden? Bednar claims that members need the blessings that come from obeying commandments. But would they not be better off paying their own bills and getting blessings from obeying commandments that actually serve a purpose? After all, Joseph F. Smith predicted a day where tithing would no longer be necessary.
We expect to see the day when we will not have to ask you for $1 of donation for any purpose, except that which you volunteer to give of your own accord, because we will have tithes sufficient in the storehouse of the Lord to pay everything that is needful for the advancement of the kingdom of God.
It seems like that day has arrived. So why does the church continue to press its poor members for donations? Here are just a few examples of times the church has told poor members to pay tithing before taking care of their own needs. As you listen, keep in mind that these statements are coming from an organization now known to have around $200 billion in assets.
No bishop, no missionary should ever hesitate or lack the faith to teach the law of tithing to the poor. The sentiment of they can't afford to needs to be replaced with they can't afford not to. One of the first things a bishop must do to help the needy is ask them to pay their tithing. If a destitute family is faced with the decision of paying their tithing or eating, they should pay their tithing. The bishop can help them with their food.
After some events related to a civil war in Central America, my father's business went bankrupt. One day, during those difficult times, I heard my parents discussing whether they should pay tithing or buy food for the children. On Sunday, I followed my father to see what he was going to do. After our church meetings, I saw him take an envelope and put his tithing in it.
If paying tithing means that you can't pay for water or electricity, pay tithing. If paying tithing means that you can't pay your rent, pay tithing. Even if paying tithing means that you don't have enough money to feed your family, pay tithing. The Lord will not abandon you.
We preach tithing to the poor people of the world because the poor people of the world have had cycles of poverty, generation after generation. That same poverty continues from one generation to another until people pay their tithing.
No one is ever too poor to pay tithing, and the Lord has promised that He will open the windows of heaven when we are obedient to His law. However, if we like luxuries or even necessities more than we like obedience, we will miss the blessings which He would like to give us. The tithing principle is a solution for poverty.
There's a great need for saints all over the world to begin to sacrifice for temple building. I recall how, when the Sao Paulo temple was being built, members in Argentina found ways to donate. They gave the gold from their dental work to help pay on the temple. I've purchased some of that gold for more than the market price. I have shown these gold fillings to various congregations to illustrate the nature of the sacrifice made by these members.
The church will try to justify their extortion of the poor with promises that tithing will miraculously solve their poverty. They offer no explanation for how this works in real life, or any data suggesting that it ever has, only anecdotes and vague promises. In reality, there is no evidence that LDS tithe payers fare any better financially than anyone else. In fact, a 2008 BYU article from faithful financial experts seemed to recognize tithing as the net negative that it is. So much for the open windows of heaven and blessings too great to receive. The LDS Church teaches that paying tithing is necessary for exaltation. Here's Hartman Rector explaining why.
Then those who walk in holiness before the Lord, which includes the payment of tithing, will have an eternal family at the last day. And those who do not pay tithing will have none. Tithing is necessary in order to receive the blessings of the temple. If a man were to keep all the Lord's commandments with exception of tithing, he could still never be married for time and all eternity in the temple. Thus would have neither roots nor branches at the last day. Then this becomes really serious. Since there is no exaltation without our family, as we think about it, we know this is true.
It's worth pondering if a loving and just God would really place a paywall on heaven. I can't say that I know one way or the other, but I have a hard time believing that heaven requires any form of financial obligation, especially from anyone who is barely scraping by. Yet that is what the church teaches. The LDS concept of God is someone who demands that the poor neglect their bills and children, throw their pittance on top of the church's looming mountain of assets, and rely on the mercy of their bishop for support. The church often tries to characterize tithing as a voluntary donation. This implies that paying tithing is optional and non-compulsory, something a member can decide not to pay without consequence. However, elsewhere they call it an obligation, a debt, and a requirement. Some apostles have even suggested that we have no choice but to pay tithing. Here's David Bednar explaining that members have no agency or choice in the matter.
Now, I want to say this in terms that I hope won't be scary, but they're true. If, after having entered into the covenant, we don't abide by the conditions of the covenant. So, for example, if you and I don't pay our tithing, do we have the option not to pay our tithing? Nope. It's breaking a covenant. It is not the exercise of agency anymore. Because what happened to our individual agency? It was enlarged. Now it's more important to represent Him. Is this making sense?
Tithing is also the only commandment that has a yearly meeting dedicated to making sure members are in compliance, and non-payment results in a loss of temple access and being cut off from exaltation and your eternal family. To describe the LDS version of tithing as voluntary is false. A bank teller facing violence from a robber doesn't voluntarily give them cash. They are coerced into compliance by the threat of violence. They are under duress. Members similarly face eternal separation from their families, and that threat makes their decision to pay involuntary and coerced. The church presents members with a simplistic and idealized idea of where their hard-earned money ends up. They only list expenditures that seem above board and religious in nature, like missionary work and humanitarian aid. However, the church has used its lack of financial disclosure to spend money on things members may not have felt appropriate for sacred funds.
1, 2, 3, let's go shopping!
The church spent $1.5 billion in tithing to build City Creek Center, a 700,000 square foot shopping mall with a retractable roof, Bellagio-style water fountains, waterfalls, and a landscaped creek.
Beneficial Financial Group, formerly Beneficial Life Insurance Company.
The church spent $600 million in tithing bailing out Beneficial Life, a life insurance company owned by the church that made bad investments in mortgage-backed securities and went under in 2009.
Reliability, trust, leadership, competence, safety, dependability. Beneficial is like one's own family.
Deseret Land and Livestock, a 200,000-acre ranch and hunting resort owned by the church and staffed by full-time missionaries, serves wealthy people looking to hunt big game. The church also bought Deseret Ranch in Florida, along with numerous other properties. It's the largest private landowner in Florida, owning more than 2% of the entire state's land. The church spent $190,000 to pass Prop 8 in an attempt to deny marriage to gay couples in California. The church offered a $250 million payout in an attempt to avoid liability for abuse that happened both within and outside of the Boy Scout program. Some will argue that the money spent on these things wasn't tithing money, since most of it came from earnings made from investing tithing money. However, when it comes to church expenditures, all money ultimately comes from the members' tithing payments, and any earnings on investing tithing ought to be spent on the same things members expected when they paid their tithing. Any expenditures outside of what the church advertises tithing will be used for is a breach of the tithe payer's trust. If you believe that the church is currently teaching tithing correctly, and that it can't change its current practice of tithing the poor unnecessarily, it's worth noting examples of how incredibly wrong it has been in the past. During Brigham Young's presidency, the church allowed members to pay tithing in the form of slaves. Green flake was donated to the church in 1854, and Brigham used his labor for over a year before freeing him. John Brown deeded an African servant girl worth $1,000 to the church in 1857. Does God accept slaves as tithing, or did Brigham accept slaves as tithing against the will of God? Is God a racist slaver, or does God merely allow prophets to stain his church with the sin of slavery without correction? Is it God's will that the poor rely on the church for necessities after paying the church money that they can't afford? Is it God's will that they sacrifice their teeth while the church secretly hoards hundreds of billions in untouched assets? Is it God's will that they deceive and break laws to amass wealth that they don't use for the purposes they advertise to members? I invite members to ask themselves these hard questions, and also ask their bishops at each tithing settlement. I invite them to call for the reinstitution of financial transparency and the cessation of the predatory tithing of the poor. I invite them to call for making tithing voluntary and decoupling it as a requirement for temple ordinances and salvation.